welcome to all of you. Hopefully you're wide awake after coming back from lunch. This is an interesting panel for me. I'm curious to see where this conversation takes us as somebody who's on the news side of things. I don't know if I should be excited or a little afraid, maybe, but, let's just kind of kick things off with setting the scene with where things are right now. And Gary, I want to throw the question to you as somebody who oversees SCMP about what you've seen in terms of how people are consuming their news right now. I know the question was just put to the audience. Is it on Twitter? Is it on Facebook? Is it that other site that people don't check out? Yeah. What are you seeing in terms of user behavior?
Well, it's obviously changed a heck of a lot, but what is so scary to the news industry, or at the very least the legacy news industry, is the fact that the change continues. And actually, the rhythm of change is accelerating. So every few months now, it feels like there's a new Discovery Channel that we don't understand as the industry and that we have to adjust to, right? For instance, as a great example of where we're at right now, when Casey was listing out those options, the one that he nearly forgot was newspapers, right?
TV.
It was the fact that, and totally forgot was TV, right? And the reality is that the traditional sources and channels of news discovery and the traditional, and this is what's really important for us, the traditional gatekeepers of what constitutes high-quality journalism, of what constitutes, to some degree, truth, and the objective perspective around truth, those gatekeepers have disappeared. And for most of the younger consumers that are part of our audience, the channels that they're going to don't feel an accountability to actually be those same kinds of gatekeepers. So yeah, the industry is changing significantly, but what's even more worrying is that it continues to change ever faster, and the rest of us is just trying to keep up.
Irene, let me bring you into the conversation because obviously with Google, you can be the best friend to news organizations, maybe sometimes not. Let's talk about the algorithm itself.
Okay.
Because, I think a lot of newsrooms are trying to figure out, how do you try to beat it? Do you try to get to the top of it? How does it work in terms of, I don't know if you use the word calculation, but how what actually comes to the top of the Google News list?
Sure. So when you search on Google, the main driver for what you receive back is exactly what you searched. So whatever cluster of words that you type in, what we're trying to figure out is what is the relevance and what is authoritative, relevant, and also locally relevant. So depending on where you're located, depending on what language you're searching on, what is going to be most useful to you. So it's interesting that you get into this question of, editorial judgment and, those curators and those gatekeepers. We are constantly trying to hone our own algorithm to ensure that high-quality information is at the top, authoritative, trustworthy sources are at the top. And one of the ways that we do this, interestingly, is, we are driven by an algorithm and machine learning, is we have to train that algorithm. And the way that we do that is we employ search raters who are actual human beings who go and essentially...
Raters as in R-A-T-E-R-S.
R-A-T-E-R-S. Yes, so essentially when somebody... what they're doing is they're testing how well the algorithm is delivering relevant content. And so there is a 160-page guideline that anyone can download if you really want some light reading about what they're looking for in terms of assessing relevancy and authoritativeness. And so what they do then is when they look at a search term, they look at the relevance. They also go to those sources that appear in search, and they're looking for signals that that website is authoritative and relevant to whatever they're searching. So for a breaking news event in Hong Kong, certainly the South China Morning Post would be considered an authoritative source. If I'm looking at a specific drill bit for my workshop, then I hate to say it, Gary, but probably you're not going to be the source that we want to go to. You'd probably want to find some blog where somebody wrote about that specific drill bit. So really trying to hone that. And that is actually driven by human beings who are teaching the algorithm to surface that information.
And I won't get too much into the fake news bit, but I know a lot of people are wondering, well, so how do you weed that out? You say the authoritative organizations, so to speak, the credible ones, if you can hone in on that and see sort of the sourcing behind that, how do you weed out what's not accurate, or how do you make that judgment?
So that's a really important question, and certainly something that we've been grappling with quite a bit over the past few years. But to take a step back, people have been trying to game search since the beginning of search, right? They've just been trying to make sure that they go to the top, and there are all kinds of games that people have tried to play. We've had to adapt our algorithm to adjust that. But in terms of specifically the issue now, we're talking about quote-unquote fake news, misinformation, disinformation, hoaxes. What we are trying to do is actually work with the news industry and other sources of high-quality information so that they put in signals that the algorithm can actually read. So we have a couple of things. One is called the fact check tag, also known as claim review schema. And literally, news organizations can actually code around their stories and say, we're verifying or checking this claim, this is our assessment, this is why. And so that allows our algorithm to read that better and surface that information. We're also working on something called the Trust Project, which is essentially ensuring that newsrooms adopt best practices in terms of what they put on their websites so that our search raters and others, and just regular readers, will know how did they do their reporting, what kind of ethical guidelines do they have, who is the person who's writing the article, what is their experience. I think that this speaks to one of the questions that Gary raised, which is, not only do tech companies and platforms, they're not the only ones who are trying to figure out what is credible and what's not. Individual users are all the time. And the problem is that in this virtual world, those signals are not as clear, right? If you open a newspaper, the front is the front, the op-ed pages are in one area. There's very clear labeling so people can know what they're consuming. And I think that we haven't quite gotten there yet in the virtual world.
Ram, I want to bring you into the conversation because you bring a different perspective here. Both of you have journalism backgrounds, also having worked in tech too. You're kind of taking this from an investor perspective. How do you view this debate that's playing out in terms of old media versus new media and how algorithms play a role in how we consume things every day?
Right. We're investors in Google, very happy investors, don't get me wrong. I have a very different view on this. I think if you take the big picture here, the very highest quality news, like the SEMP, maybe the Wall Street Journals, maybe even CNBC, for what they do, will always have a place in the world. But that's 1% of all the information that actually matters. And since that high quality journalism, very much like the op-ed part of a newspaper, you can charge very high prices for that, whether it be advertising, subscription, and that's the way the business model will continue over time. For a vast majority, the rest of the content, there is no reason that you need scribes and journalists in the picture. If you look at the evolution of content on the internet, it started with Google aggregating stuff, Yahoo indexing pages, and then you went to some sort of UGC/personalization mechanism with Twitter. And now we evolved, I think, with companies like Toutiao, with UGC meets machine-written content. And this machine-written content now is pretty dumb. Like, it's a fact about what happened yesterday or day before yesterday. But as the machine gets trained more and more on all the information out there, it can, for example, it can look at a political event that happened, look at all the people who are biased left, all the people biased right, and then actually create content with very little bias in it. So my actual view is the problem with human editors, especially for qualitative content, is you can't remove bias. And where algos will win in the long term, and they're not there anytime right now, is they will create news articles with less bias than a human editor can ever hope to create.
Gary, you want to jump in on that? That seems like
Gary,
fighting words.
those are fighting words, man.
To clarify, I actually don't have a journalism background, which is what makes it strange that I'm in the position I'm in, and probably makes it strange that I have the position that I do hold in this argument, which is that news organizations, and I'm going to steal a quote from the managing editor of the New York Times, is that great news organizations are meant to transcend any single opinion. So it's not about removing bias from authoritative news and information. It's about reporting the facts the way that they happened, as closely to truth as we can, and then to provide a perspective that we believe as a news organization matters to the world. Sometimes that means coming down as a news organization in our editorial and saying, this is what we believe to be right. And then other times it's, let me share with you multiple perspectives that exist in the world effectively on the same plane, and then let the user educate themselves and decide for themselves. when an algorithm, when we decide that we're going to use machine to remove bias, which, by the way, frankly, I just don't believe any algorithmically driven news product actually wants to do, because it's bad for business. It's bad for Toutiao to remove bias because information becomes bland. We all know human psychology means that we are much more likely to click on things we already agree with, right? And we're likely to share those same things as well. So it's bad for business to remove bias and be fully objective. But I think news organizations would tell you that is actually not good for progress, for civil discourse, because that's not the purpose of news. The purpose of news is to report the facts and then have an opinion about what truth and what speaking to power actually looks like and actually means. So you can tell I'm passionate about this because this matters, because right now, the biggest problem media literacy in the world and why these algorithmically driven news feeds are, in my opinion, bad for the world today is the fact that they just misunderstand the purpose of news in the world. Now listen, Ram, I agree with you. I have no problem saying that news is a tiny part of overall content consumption, because it's always been that way. News has always been the broccoli to your steak. And I don't expect to change that. I don't think we need to change that. But I think companies that ostensibly are news companies, Toutiao being one of them, the name of the company is literally headlines, right? It's today's headlines. It's the name of the company. When they decide that I'm not going to separate what is news and what is just content, and I'm going to mash it together and pretend that all of it is equal in value as news, that I think is bad for all of us.
Gary, let me press you on that point, because I think then the debate becomes, look, the reality is you can put out the best content out there, but you've got to get clicks on it. And there's algorithms that are out there that you want to get on, you want to get to the top of. How do you find that balance between what it is that you want to report, but also being mindful of how people consume the news today?
This is where we need platforms to be partners, because the reality is the news industry long ago abdicated our ability to control the entire distribution stack. Okay, that's our fault, is that we didn't pay attention to the changes in consumer behavior for a long time. So now news organizations have to play this algorithm game across all distribution channels. There are very few news organizations in the world that can truly say we own a one-on-one relationship with all of our audience. So those of us, like the South China Morning Post, we exist, obviously on our own and operated, but also on Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of the distribution channels. What we need to do is we need to focus purely on what we believe to be news and try our best not to play the clickbait game. All of us do. Our news organization is sometimes at fault for that as well, and that's because of economics. But what would really, really help our ability to continue to strive for and focus on quality journalism is if these distribution channels that keep trying to convince us that they're trying to be partners feel an accountability to say, I am going to separate what is news and what is the rest of content that people want to consume. And I feel that there's a responsibility as an important part of civil society to prioritize news at times so that I'm giving you broccoli with steak.
But Gary, this is exactly what today's organizations are doing. Now, if you go back 5 years, I would argue that they destroyed the news industry. But if you look at Facebook's commentary, Google's commentary, I think they realize that news orgs are very important, which is why they have specific whitelists of great news organizations. And if it's provided by the SCMP, it's there. All I'm saying is, that's 1% of actual news content, right? There's a path in the world for that. They'll find ways to work with you, whether it's Facebook or Google or Twitter, everybody else. But my bigger point is general information. If you had a paper, 60 pages thick, there's probably 2 pages of real content there. And that's the equivalent today of today's high-quality news companies. You need those 2 pages. That will never go away. It's very important. And frankly, you can command a huge CPM for that. My point is the remaining 70 pages of advertising doesn't need to be humanly curated anymore.
We only have a few minutes left, but Irene, I want to bring you, kind of into the conversation as somebody who has been on both sides. You've been a journalist, but now you are in a position with Google to be having these conversations with news organizations. Where do you see the future going?
Well, I think that there are a few points here. One is defining, as Gary said, the difference between content and facts and journalism. I think the idea about journalism is to make sense of the world and to communicate it to an audience, right? Because people are busy, they live their lives, they don't have time, journalists spend all day learning about something and communicating it in 500 words, right? So there is an editorial role. And, I hate to say this, but I mean, yes, algorithms are very good at surfacing facts and putting them together, but that role of asking questions, computers are not good at that. They're good at answering questions. And so the role of the journalist will never change in that way, and the role of news organizations as the institution and the infrastructure to enable individuals to be employed to do that work is not going to change. Specifically to this issue of platforms and I think the role, I think that yes, platforms have an increased understanding of their obligations and their responsibilities. Google, I'm hired as someone who came out of the news industry with no tech background to be that voice of journalism within the company, right, along with my colleagues. Right. But I think that, certainly at the end of the day, we have not even, it's not the end of the story, it's ever evolving. We need to, as an industry, working with news organizations, develop that common language and communicate that to the users. This goes to the question about media literacy, so that when people encounter content, whether it's UGC, user-generated content, whether it's facts cobbled together by an algorithm, whether it's content written by a columnist or an investigative reporter, that they know what the difference is and that there are very clear ways for users, readers, and algorithms to figure out how to sift through the noise.
So more education, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Not necessarily the death of these news organizations per se, but, with all the noise out there, sort of educating to get through all of that.
Absolutely. Google, we do separate, a regular search and Google News, and we recently launched an app called the Google News app, which is about actually cutting through the polarization, the biases. We have a function called full coverage, which is the idea is that if you're interested in a topic, you click on it, and algorithmically, it's curating stories from numerous sources from multiple points of view so that you can actually get a full picture. So I think as an industry working in partnership with news, we are coming to the conclusion that we have to be better stewards of that content and to signal that to readers, but also, every high school kid should learn how to not only read a newspaper, but learn how to read news on all the platforms. I think that it's a crucial part of where we're headed. And honestly, we're not going to be able to do this until, news organizations and tech companies are partnering to come up with that common language.
Okay, we'll have to leave it on that note. Thanks so much, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.